10-minute murder.
If you know true crime, you've heard of the Zodiac Killer. He's one of the world's most famous serial murderers, even though 5 decades have passed since his killing spree. And 50 years on, his case is still wide open, with law enforcement working to uncover the identity of the man who killed at least 5 people between late 1968 and 1969. Why does the world still have such a fascination with an unidentified killer from the 1960s? The crimes carried out by the Zodiac were not unusual. 5 confirmed murders where 2 young couples and 1 lone cab driver were shot to death. 2 other victims had been wounded but survived their injuries, but they weren't able to identify the assailant. The descriptions of the killer provided by their survivors are vague enough that they could have been almost anyone. A white, brown-headed male, late 20s or early 30s, around 200 pounds. Less than 6 feet tall, wearing dark clothing. There was nothing about him that seemed especially memorable, apart from the fact that he was killing strangers without remorse, and the one report of him wearing a black execution-style hood while approaching his victims. It's possible that if all he had done is murder his victims and then disappear, he might have been forgotten by now. But it wasn't necessarily the killings themselves that made the Zodiac so notorious. It was what he did next. It was not uncommon for serial killers to contact police or local media, inserting themselves into the investigation, making threats or taunting the cops for not being able to catch them quickly enough. The Zodiac did this, even calling the police to report a murder shortly after he had finished shooting his victims. He also seemed to have some knowledge of how to slow down law enforcement, killing several of his victims in areas where police jurisdiction overlapped, making the investigations slower. One of the reasons for the Zodiac Killer's notoriety is the sheer volume of letters that he submitted to local newspapers, taking responsibility for the recent killings, including encrypted text puzzles called cryptograms, one of which he claimed would reveal his identity if solved. He said that if the letters weren't published on the front page of the newspaper, he'd kill 12 people over the weekend. It was in one of these letters that he gave himself a nickname. "Dear Editor," the letter began, "this is the Zodiac speaking." He was responding to a request by the Vallejo police chief, who had asked the author of the previous letters to prove that they were the real killer by revealing details that the public weren't aware of. Sure enough, the letter from the Zodiac contained details about the crimes that only the killer would know. It was confirmed. They had been communicating directly with the man who would quickly become known by his own nickname. They were reading a letter from the Zodiac Killer. One of the letters contained a list of ways in which the killer had supposedly murdered his victims, including 2 methods which had not been seen in any of the linked cases: by rope, presumably meaning strangulation, and by fire. In the confirmed killings, the Zodiac's weapons of choice had either been a military-style bladed weapon or an automatic pistol. It seemed as if he preferred using guns. He'd admitted in one of his letters to taping a flashlight to his pistol, allowing him to aim when shooting at night. In another letter, he claimed to be responsible for 37 murders. The details the Zodiac had provided in his letters so far had been accurate. What if he was telling the truth, and he had other victims that had not been connected to the case? Out of all the murders that could possibly be linked to the Zodiac Killer, the Santa Rosa hitchhiker murders were probably the most famous. During the early 1970s, at least 7 women hitchhiking through California's North Bay area were murdered, stripped, and found dumped in an isolated area or in creek beds. The killer was never found, but the Zodiac Killer has remained near the top of the list of suspects, especially after an occult symbol similar to those in his letters was found by the body of one of the hitchhikers. Several of the victims had been slowly strangled to death with a length of cord. Could this have been what the Zodiac meant when referring to rope? This was the kind of valuable information provided by the Zodiac Killer's communication, hints at his MO, his personality, and other crimes that he may have committed. It was likely that, one day, the Zodiac's letters would be the thing that got him caught. DNA advancements, getting too confident, revealing too much information, there were so many traps that he could have fallen into. But in 1974, all communication from the Zodiac Killer ceased. It seemed as if he might have just stopped killing, but it was hard to tell without the taunting messages and damning letters linking the cases together and proving that the killer was the same. Investigators were left trying to solve the puzzles that he'd provided, while also narrowing down a hefty list of suspects. The only suspect whose name was ever made public was a convicted sex offender, Arthur Lee Allen. Some of the circumstantial evidence was suspicious. Arthur lived close to one of the victims. He'd been in the area when at least one of the young couples were murdered, and one of his friends had told the police that Arthur talked about wanting to murder people, and even used the name Zodiac to refer to himself. Other pieces of evidence, I'm using air quotes there, seem more like grasping at straws. Arthur owned a wristwatch made by the brand Zodiac. He used the same typewriter that one of the letters had been written on. But all the evidence against Arthur Lee Allen was just that, circumstantial. In 2002, a decade after Arthur passed away, a DNA profile was created from samples of the Zodiac Killer's saliva. Arthur's DNA was compared to the sample. It was not a match. Lloyd Cunningham, a police handwriting expert who had worked on the case, said this about the possibility of Arthur Allen being the killer. Quote, "They gave me banana boxes full of Arthur Lee's writing, and none of his writing even came close to the Zodiac, nor did DNA extracted from the envelopes on the Zodiac's letters come close to Arthur Lee Allen." In total, 4 cryptogram puzzles were sent by the Zodiac Killer. One cipher was solved shortly after it was published, providing the insight that the author, quote, "liked killing people because it was so much fun." For years, investigators, code breakers, and puzzle enthusiasts worked together on a common goal, solving the remaining 3 ciphers. As time passed, many people began to wonder if the ciphers were impossible to solve. It would make sense for a killer who liked to taunt the police to mess with them in this way, providing 3 cryptograms that were gibberish and one that was easy to solve, making them waste their time and energy trying to solve an impossible puzzle. As it turned out, this theory was not true, at least not for all 3 remaining ciphers. In 2020, amateur code breakers got in contact with the FBI. They believed that they had solved one of the 3 remaining cryptograms, nicknamed the 340 cipher, because of the number of characters in the puzzle. The 340 cipher had been infamously sent to the newspaper alongside a ripped, blood-stained section of one of the victim's shirts, concrete proof that the author was the killer. In December 2020, an FBI spokesperson gave a statement, quote, "The FBI is aware that a cipher attributed to the Zodiac Killer was recently solved by private citizens." The break in the case was officially confirmed. Half of the Zodiac ciphers were now solved. Although the 340 cipher's message referenced an incident where a man pretending to be the Zodiac Killer had called into a local talk show, it did not reveal his true identity. Instead, it gave insight into the inner monologue of a man who had murdered in cold blood and taunted the police for fun. It read, quote, "I hope you're having lots of fun and trying to catch me. That wasn't me on the TV show, which brings up a point about me. I'm not afraid of the gas chamber because it will send me to paradise all the sooner. Because I now have enough slaves to work for me where everyone else has nothing when they reach for paradise, so they are afraid of death. I am not afraid because I know my new life will be an easy one in death." That is 10-Minute Murder for today. Brief and bingeable true crime. I'm Joe. I'm the host, and thank you for listening today. If this is your first time listening to 10-Minute Murder, please subscribe now so that you can catch up on all the back episodes and never miss any of the new episodes. Connect with me on social media, see the visuals of what we're talking about here in the podcast, And if you like this episode, please leave a rating and review on Apple or any place that reviews are possible. Your positive feedback helps the show grow so much. Go to 10minutemurder.com for all things related to 10-Minute Murder. And now quickly, let's get to an email. If you'd like to send me an email, by the way, my email address is joe@10minutemurder.com. Joe, are you an introvert or an extrovert? That is from Roxy in Killeen, Texas. Roxy, I'm an introvert, but it's complicated. I can be somewhere with a lot of people. I'll talk, I'll move around, I'll say funny things, but it's not my authentic self. That's not normal for me. My normal is quiet. And while I'm at whatever social gathering I'm attending, when the urge hits that I've had enough, my social battery is dangerously low to empty, I'm out. Because otherwise I'll find a quiet spot, sit on the floor and pet the dog of the house. So I'm an introvert with occasional extrovert tendencies. You wouldn't know unless you know. That's going to do it for this episode. Thank you so much for listening to 10-Minute Murder. Goodbye.